I have a confession to make. I have made some poor decisions in my life based on an overinflated ego and a skewed view of masculinity. And it began early. As the 15-year-old captain of a cricket team in a small country town called Narromine, New South Wales, I thought I was pretty good. Whee! I opened the bowling, I batted high in the order, I fielded in slips. I certainly got my money's worth on a Saturday morning. And we had this guy playing for us who would always come up and ask me, "Can I have a bowl?" "No," I would say, "go to fine leg." "Please," he would plead with me. "No, you're hopeless, go away." Anyway, a few years later, this guy went on to bigger and better things. Glenn McGrath became arguably the greatest fast bowler in the history of cricket, but apparently he wasn't good enough for the backwater under-16s. My ego has a lot to answer for. And when I talk about ego, especially the untamed ego, I think about it as being like a dog that pulls its owner uncontrollably around the streets. I'm sure we've all seen that, right? Instead of the owner being in control, the dog is the one dictating the terms and calling the shots. And so it is with ego. And we only need to look at many of the media reports showing, for example, boys behaving badly to see how that plays out. So what's driving it? I think it's our take on what it is to be a man. So our traditional view of masculinity holds that men should be, among other things, providers, protectors and procreators, with guiding behaviours like aggression, competitiveness and toughness and risk-taking as guiding behaviours that form a metaphorical map with which we walk through manhood or navigate through manhood. Now, none of these are actually wrong or bad per se, but when they are the unconscious fallback position, like aggression, for example, instead of a conscious choice, I think then we have a problem. And we only need to look at some of the overwhelming evidence showing males dominating categories such as suicide, violent crime, antisocial behaviour and spousal abuse, just to name a few. In an international violence against women survey, 57% of Australian women reported experiencing at least one incident of violent, physical or sexual violence at the hands of a man over their lifetime. So that begs a question. Is our societal view of masculinity still valid? Does the map we're running off still fit the territory we are in? And when I think of the map not fitting the territory, I can't help but think of the many times that I spent when I was in Police Special Operations Group navigating or stumbling through the bush on navigation exercises. It wasn't unusual to get a bit lost at times, and I'd often look at the map and think, this map's wrong. Of course the map wasn't wrong, I just wasn't in the right place. So physically and metaphorically, if the map that we're running off doesn't fit with where we are, we can be a bit lost. And I think guys can get a bit lost at times, especially when they're adhering to the traditional map view that perhaps men shouldn't show emotion or that they need to be emotionally detached. I'm sure people would have experiences of that in this room. I know myself, it has been a very difficult one to overcome and one that has caused damage in the past. I remember about 20 years ago, I was in the police and I was working by myself in Sydney and going against all of my training, I went into a house for a domestic violence dispute. And I ran into the house, even though there was screaming and we're not supposed to do all that and go into the house alone. I ran into the house, I ran past a distraught mother, I ran up a set of stairs, I went into a bedroom, and I was confronted by the sight of a 15-year-old boy who had just killed himself with a shotgun. I'm not even going to try and describe what I saw, but I walked back out of the room, I walked back down the stairs, I briefly tried to console a shattered mother, as you could imagine. I spoke to some other police, and then I don't remember anything after that. I didn't speak to anyone. I put it in a corner of my mind as a way of coping. I stored it away to show that I was tough enough to be able to handle anything thrown my way, and as my way of actually handling that particular trauma. Even when I was at home and my then wife was suffering chronic depression and post-traumatic stress. I was an empty vessel. My response to her suffering was inept at best, amounting to a she'll be right attitude. I wasn't emotionally mature enough to understand or even help her, even when she was hospitalised after attempting suicide. And when my then 7-year-old son was screaming in agony at the beach after being stung by blue bottles, my response to his crying was to get angry at him because I thought the boys don't cry. Ridiculous. Now, it could be argued that some of the things from the traditional map or the ways of viewing manhood are a part of our DNA, and I get that. But if that's the case, surely we've evolved enough where we can actually recognise what we still need and then move forward with a different view of manhood in the future, thus creating a map with which we can navigate successfully. A map which might say that we can be strong and sensitive at the same time and everything in between. You know, Hugh Jackman. Yeah, I reckon just about everyone agrees with me, and I'm not just talking about the ladies. You know, he sings, he dances, he acts. He's Wolverine. Actually, scratch that, he's Wolverine in a tutu. So what would this look like? What would this map look like? I think just some really simple benefits would be things like gender equality. You know, sexual preference would be accepted as normal parts of community. Violent crime would be on the decrease. Domestic violence may not be as common as it is today. And we're not talking about utopia. These are aspirational goals for our society. And I believe this generation and the ones that follow are very capable of doing it. We often hear the younger generation criticised for their lack of work ethic or being self-entitled, obsessed with social media, maybe even addicted to selfies. Hang on that note, I'm going to take one. Here we go. Let's go. All right. All right. But let's be honest. The older generation have been whinging about the next for at least the last 2,500 years. Apparently even Socrates whinged about the younger generation for being too lazy. But that's what humans do, isn't it? We gather this big pile of stuff in our psyche. That's the official term, by the way. Based on the things that we've learned, and we then go forward with that as a template or a map with which we view the world. Inevitably, if somebody else's map or template is different to ours, it can cause angst. I know from my big pile of stuff, I was an out of control, insecure, heavily armed at times ego machine, ready to do anything I needed to maintain the image I perceived manhood to be. A false map which was reinforced when I was involved in counter-terrorism and special operations. So much so that I remember once walking down a street after a hostage rescue incident. I was just a bit like this. Where are we? There we are. I was just a bit like this, and I had the strut going. I was working it. I walked past a group of people, and I overheard somebody on my right say, "Geez, I wouldn't want to mess with that guy." And before my ego had the chance to do these ones again, a little voice in my head said, "Mate, if you only knew how soft I really am." It was a moment of truth, a moment of honesty that snuck out from behind the facade. But it didn't last long. The ego came up again and the puff chest came out and I strutted back down to the truck. The body armour I was wearing had become more than just protective equipment. It had become part of a false identity that I had created based on what I thought a man should be. And I was scared that somebody was going to find out and I'd be discovered as a fraud. Uneasy but not really knowing why, in 2006 I did what I'd imagine many young men have done throughout history. I ran away to a war zone. For me, it was taking up a police training role in Iraq. We had a few, fair to say, hair-raising moments, although maybe not so much for me. Gee, that took a while, didn't it? But there's an old proverb which says that the teacher arrives when the student is ready. Toward the end of my tenure, I was fortunate to have a conversation with an elderly Iraqi man we called the Professor, whose nickname reflected his previous occupation as a professor of English at Baghdad University prior to the invasion in 2003. And we're sitting outside on a balmy 50-degree day, having a conversation, and he said to me, do you enjoy it here? I thought, oh, okay, well, I can be honest with this one. No, not really. He said, well, what are you doing here? I thought, oh, well, I can't tell him the truth. I better make up something. I've got to justify why I'm here. I came here to rebuild your country. Bullshit, he said. You came here for the money. I looked at him with surprise, partly because of his use of English slang, but more so because he'd just called me on the very thing that I was most afraid of. My cover was blown. As we conversed for the next half an hour or so, I realised that this guy, a gentle Muslim man, was more like this guy. The wisdom in his words dissolved any religious differences or cultural differences that we may have had. Before we parted, he said to me, you're either guided by your soul or driven by your ego. It is only a matter of choice. And for me, these words were absolutely life-changing because they initiated a change or a move away from what I perceived to be manly or not. It altered the map that I'd been referring to most of my life. So a few weeks later, in total contrast to the oppressive heat and violence of the war zone, I found myself among the cool, peaceful mountains of Bavaria. Wait for it. Singing show tunes as part of the Sound of Music bus tour in Salzburg, Austria. And you know what? I loved it. I loved it. It felt good. In fact, it felt more than good. It felt absolutely liberating. It was like a weight was lifted off my shoulders. It was then that I decided it was time to leave the body armour, the bravado, the bullets and the bullshit behind. But when I returned to life in Australia and life at home, I was a little bit confused as to how I was going to operate without these things. What do I now cling to? What do I measure myself against? I was navigating an uncharted territory because I did not have a map to guide me through this part of my life. Not surprisingly, I fell into a bit of a depressive state, and over the next couple of years, relationship after relationship failed as I continued to make the same mistakes over and over again. For some reason, perhaps as a way of making sense of the turmoil, I started writing a book. Firstly, as to what I thought would be an altruistic way to help others. But really, it was beneficial and cathartic for me. So many of the things that needed to be thought about, openly expressed, even cried about, were extracted during this process. It was only while I was writing that I remembered the incident with a 15-year-old boy who had killed himself all those years earlier. Memories that brought back a flood of emotion as I wept uncontrollably for what seemed like an eternity. And there were some other things that helped along the way as well. I spoke to good family and friends. I went on a 10-day meditation retreat which was totally silent. You didn't speak. Well, that was interesting. I went 5 years without sex. That was even more interesting. Actually, that's another TED talk. But really what it was is that I didn't want to make the same mistakes over again and cause collateral damage along the way as well. But one of the most recent parts of the redefinition has been a return to doing one of the things that I really enjoyed as a kid, before peer pressure and all those things took over. Musical theatre. I'm shortly going to be playing the role of Captain Von Trapp in The Sound of Music. Talk about things coming full circle. But I'm really enjoying the chance to sing and dance and act again without worrying about how this impacts on my masculine image, because I know now that it doesn't. Thankfully, as I continue to leave behind the old map, critical friendships and relationships have been repaired. I now enjoy a great friendship with my ex-wife, who has a new family and a new husband who is a very good man, who looks after her and our 2 children with love and respect. I can't ask any more than that. Perhaps a different view of masculinity would hold that I was to be jealous or protective of things that I'd previously owned, but honestly, it just doesn't compute anymore. I've reconnected with Glenn McGrath. And when we chat, we revert back to our teenage years. He says to me something like, I used to hate you as a kid. I say, I used to hate you too. You never used to give me a bowl. That's because you were rubbish. And then we just have a big laugh about how stupid it all was. And Glenn was very kind to write a very nice endorsement for the book. And as far as my son goes, this is us just a few days ago. He's a skydiving instructor. This is us free falling from 14,000 feet, as I said just a few days ago. It was a leap of faith, literally, in his ability as a skydiving instructor, and he literally had my life in his hands. It was a marvellous reversal of control, and for any parents out there, I recommend it. Not so much skydiving, but the reversal of control thing. So overall, this idea of living peacefully with a broader sense of what constitutes a man is the message that I now take to young guys in schools as an educator about masculinity. You know, using the contrast from gun-toting, black pyjama-wearing tough guy to singing, dancing, acting thespian as just one method or example that our idea of masculinity does not have to be mutually exclusive. We can be compassionate and loving and still maintain a strong sense of who we are as men. We can hold the villain at bay with one arm and cradle a baby in the other. Of course, it's not a magic pill or a silver bullet, but what I have noticed is a distinct release of pressure off the shoulders of the young men that we speak to. It's like they've been given permission to recreate their own map instead of just blindly following someone else's. And I'd like to think that these men in the future will become advocates for equality, where their idea of masculinity is not driven by the domination of others based on gender, sexual preference, religion, culture, or race. I think that for peace in our communities, we really do need to have a look at the unconscious things that drive us. And for 50% of us, that will require a redefinition of our masculine map. As the professor said, it is only a matter of choice. I'm still a work in progress, but we are all agents of change. As Robert Frost said, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the road less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. Which way will you go?